Standing Up with Compassion weekend retreat. A very timely topic of which we are in the process of unpacking this week with a lot of cooperation, sharing from everybody. So we'll begin first with our prayers, and then we'll spend some time just bringing ourselves into the space, into the present moment. Whatever happened yesterday, let's leave at the door. Whatever we have concerns about regarding the future, let's also leave that at the door. And then we'll have some silent meditation. I'll set a short motivation, then we'll go from there.
I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
May all sentient beings have
Happiness and its causes.
May all sentient beings be free of suffering and its causes. May all sentient beings not be separated from sorrow's bliss. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of bias, attachment, and anger.
So once again, try to keep the mind in the moment, using either the breath or the image of the Buddha to focus on. So for the motivation this morning, so it appears to us that we are in the middle of an unprecedented series of national world events that at times seem overwhelming, but as Venerable Damcho clearly observed last night, and I think quite correct, is that this is not unprecedented, that the human family and this planet has been through historical conflicts, diseases, corruption, fraud, violence over the course of its world history. It is the samsaric event of this planet, and throughout the universe, it's replicating itself over and over again. But that we have the technology and the science and the capacity to bring this suffering into real time, into our homes, into our offices, into our classrooms, is the unprecedented quality of it. And so when we, hold that and see what the human family is doing to each other and to other beings, to see how heartbreaking that is. And sometimes we almost don't think that we can watch it any longer. But one of the preciousnesses and the rarities that we have is that we have a spiritual path that gives us, through the guidance of the Buddha, who he himself has experienced all of that in the course of his path to awakening. He has learned, he has identified, he has experienced those things, in that he found the way to antidote them, to counteract them, to be able to not be part of that suffering. And through his incredible love and compassion and his bodhicitta for sentient beings, he laid out a very precise, profound path in which we get to identify the causes of why we are compelled to do all of this harm to ourselves and others, that it is true that it's happening right now, that there's a path to end it and to free ourselves and others. And so in the middle of all this suffering, for this particular spiritual path, there is a lot of hope, there is a lot of wisdom, there is a lot of empowerment to each and every one of us to be able to eventually, little by little, to be able to look suffering square in the face without falling apart, without falling into distress, without becoming enraged and furious with what we see. And so that ethical conduct is the foundation of that counter activity for ourselves first, to be able to model how to not harm, but to be of benefit. And that bodhicitta is sort of the huge umbrella, the vast ocean in which these small drops of ethical conduct fall. So although the vast bodhicitta motivation seems to be untenable at any given time in our minds, the practice of ethical conduct is totally doable, and that it builds drop by drop into this vast ocean of bodhicitta. And that it is the foundation of all good qualities, the foundation of all wisdom, all compassion that we will ever actualize on the path. And so this morning, let's really look at ethical conduct as one of the great powers that we have within our own minds, to be able to actualize the path not only for our own benefit, but for the long-term benefit of our own awakening in order to be of the greatest benefit. So let's try and do that this morning. Yeah. So before I get into the 3 kinds of ethical conduct, which are so crucial to understand, and because we get to practice them, we can practice them, is I wanted to share a little bit of my journey from into the Dharma and what I inadvertently brought into the Dharma that I had to work with. And part of it was to recognize a number of years ago that whether you're raised in a religious family in this culture or not, you are completely immersed and inundated with the Judeo-Christian paradigm of good, evil, reward, punishment, right or wrong. And that's infused in our politics, our education, our medical fields, our socioeconomic, everything is is right, something's got to be wrong. There's this dictate of punishment or reward, and that there is this external entity, this external God that doles out reward and punishment based on some sort of mysterious equation. And that the other piece that you recognize when you start practicing the Dharma is that there's this little bit of this wrong conception that says that we are somehow inherently flawed, thanks to some couple sometime somewhere that did something wrong, and that we're paying for it, and that Jesus actually had to pay for it ultimately by sacrificing his life for us. So that's another thing that's running under, at least was running deeply under my mind for a very, very long time. And also the particular spiritual tradition that I was raised in is that I couldn't have a direct relationship with God or Jesus, that I had to have a mediating person between me and God who had some status, had some sort of in relationship with God. And so that was the person that I would go to confess and do my prayers and be transparent, which is interesting because in the Catholic Church, maybe in many spiritual traditions, there is sort of this four-opponent power setup. You do your sin, you regret, sometimes feel guilty, but there is a remedial action. There is this process of forgiveness, making amends, and making a resolution not to do it again. It was just that the paradigm never worked for me because I was kind of out of the picture most of the time. I was just the one who was sinning and had the problem. And so what happens is that I unconsciously brought a lot of these very subconscious wrong conceptions into the Dharma. So for many, many years, even though I didn't know it until I think full ordination, that I really had the Buddha kind of imputed with somewhat of a savior power. And somehow he was going to fix things for me if I just behaved in a certain way. And that there was no creator, that I wanted him to be the creator, but he wasn't, that I was the creator, which was an extremely frightening concept. But as years went on, I found it to be an extremely empowering concept that I really took wholeheartedly. The other piece that I really had to identify is that I am not inherently flawed. In fact, I have Buddha nature, which gives me this incredible limitless possibility to attain all good qualities to perfection, to purify my mind completely, and to have this kind of capacity to benefit sentient beings to the best of my ability. And that I have total agency on creating the causes for my own happiness and my own pain. And that Buddha's gift was not his life, it wasn't his suffering, like it was for Jesus, but that his great compassion, his love and wisdom helped to lay out and to put down everything that he learned, everything he actualized to be able to attain awakening, and that he gave that in full, unpacked, profoundly practical ways. And so I've worked really hard on dismantling these wrong conceptions, and now after 26, 27 years, I feel I've gotten on the other side of them for the most part. So I just wanted to set the kind of the tone from which I'm going to be speaking about ethical conduct, that it has become a real protection for me. We hold a lot of precepts, those that are fully ordained, but I find them as years go on to be a great deep protection for my mind. And that I create the causes to bring the results that I wish. And so if I want peace and clarity and wisdom, that the Buddha has given me all the tools, all the mechanisms that I need to have to do that. So that I just wanted to preface this talk, this sharing about that. And that if you are raised in this country or in the Western culture, chances are some versions of those are probably going to be playing themselves out the deeper you get into the Dharma. Okay, so ethical conduct, why it is the foundation of the Buddhist practice. So there are two verses that we say here at the Abbey every week, and I just love them. One of them we say quite a few times a week, and one we say every Wednesday. The first one, which really lays out, the Buddha is really clear here, do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your own mind completely. This is the teaching of the Buddha. All right, that's kind of it. That's ethical conduct in a nutshell. And he talks about what the non-virtues are, what the virtuous states are. And the whole point is to subdue our own minds. That is the fundamental teaching. That is ethical conduct in its pithy form. And as a result of doing those things, as the Buddha has instructed, in parting from the four clingings, we find out what the fruits of those efforts are. It says, first, to explain ethical discipline is the root of higher transmigration. Okay, ethical conduct creates the causes for us to have this beautiful, precious human life that we have. Okay, so it's one of the main causes for higher rebirths. It's the staircase to liberation. So when it comes to the three higher trainings, this is the first step to really clear the decks of the non-virtue, the misguided thinking, the afflictions, in order to cultivate a mind that is pliant and clear and deep as a deep pool, so that we can get into the serenity, the mind that can then delve deeply into reality. So we've got the ethical conduct, first step, to provide then the causing conditions for the meditative stability, or the level of deep pliancy and wisdom and clarity that we need to then investigate how do things actually exist. So there's the staircase to liberation, with the ethical conduct being the first step. And then it's the antidote to suffering. So we don't even have to wait until next life to really generate this practice of ethical conduct, to not harm ourselves and others and to create virtue. We're going to be able to help ourselves to prevent any type of mental suffering, to be able to have harmony in our relationships, to be able to have ease in our minds, to have a kind of warmth toward the world. And so just in the present time, not even thinking about the karmic results of ethical conduct in the future, but in the present, we can have also bear the fruits of our own good behavior, our own virtuous actions. So in the parting for the four clingings, it basically says, here are the fruits of our efforts. And it says you cannot succeed without ethical discipline. And I would say, from being politicians, business people, parents, all the way up to awakening, you cannot succeed without ethical discipline. So on temporal form of just our general happiness here in this life, to all the way to awakening, we cannot succeed without ethical discipline. So this is a beautiful, here's the fruits of our labors if we practice ethical conduct. And that these three kinds of ethical conduct, we have restraint, gathering or creating the ethics of virtue, and then the ethics of benefiting others, which His Holiness calls the ethics of compassion. And that within the framework of our daily life, how can we utilize these with our engagement with others, with what's going on in the world? And once again, to bring the analogy that I used last night, is to be able to keep our moral compass calibrated in the right direction. We need some tools. And so the Buddha gave us these beautiful instructions on how to keep ethical conduct in order to be able to clear the decks, calibrate that moral compass that aligns with our deepest values, our deepest wishes, our deepest aspirations. And so part of, I know for myself, the struggle, despite years of practice, is sometimes I just don't know what to abandon. I just don't know what to cultivate, because I have been hit with either a pleasant or extremely unpleasant feeling. The narrative starts about what that really means, afflictions arise, and then I act. That it happens so fast and so hard that I don't even know where I am with my compass. And so because it happens so quickly, that I'm unable to actually pause and go, okay, what will be the result of this thought that I'm having right now? Is it going to bring happiness, or is it going to bring suffering? If I act out this negative thought, how am I going to think about myself in hindsight? Where is my integrity or my actions? I'm going against my precepts right now. I'm going against my values. I'm going against my principles. Why am I doing that? And is this action going to inspire people, or is it going to confuse them? Like, what is she doing? So even in the middle of holding precepts, this is a hard task. Ethical conduct is not an easy task in itself, because there's this continual confusion, at least for me, on what to abandon and what to cultivate. So then we go into what is the part that we're really, what is ethical conduct primarily? And Lama Tsongkhapa says, the great teacher in our particular tradition says, it's primarily mental. What we're trying to do is focus on controlling our motivations that compel us to harm, and then try to cultivate the motivations that help us to benefit and to be kind. So that when we move our bodies and open our mouths, it's going to be coming from a virtuous motivation rather than a negative one. So he says it's mostly mental, followed by our body and our speech. And then Geshe Sopa's the other part that makes a little bit more difficult here is that he says we continually point to external things outside ourselves as the cause of our problems, when in truth, it's our total obsession with our own happiness. Okay, so we've got to stop going out there and looking at the problem, looking at the causes of our happiness out there, and to bring it back home into this is where all of that lies. And so looking on this, to really understand that being desire realm beings with 5 senses, it is a total setup to be totally enamored, bedazzled, and infatuated with the objects of those 5 senses. So we're already working against a huge, the way that we're built, the way that we're born, the way that we engage is totally outward focused. What object is giving me pleasure? What object is giving me unpleasant feelings? And then off we go. And that the mental consciousness takes that pleasant, unpleasant feeling and starts building some sort of construct about how that causes happiness, how that causes suffering. And we get into all sorts of trouble because we're exaggerating or projecting onto those external objects. So we have a huge obstacle before us to be able to go internally, to realize that the cause of our happiness and pain is internally, not externally, just by abiding in this realm. Okay, so we're working against a huge, huge, huge wall of experience. Okay, so then how do we, so now we can understand why it's so hard to be ethical on this planet. We've got a lot of things that are drawing us out into the world and trying to navigate and strategize on how we can get them or how we can avoid them. We're just working it up against a big tide. Okay, so then the 3 kinds of ethical conduct. We'll start off with the ethical discipline of restraint. This is the foundation, and upon this first one, the second one of being able to gather virtue and the one of being able to benefit others sort of build on top of these. Not that they're linear, but this is really the foundation of ethical conduct, which Venerable fondly says over and over again, and she said it 2 weeks ago, is this is the stop being a jerk form of ethical conduct. This is really kind of, backing off on all the things that we do that harm others. And that basically, as the Buddha has said, and a lot of spiritual traditions also assert this, is that if we want to avoid harming others with our body, speech, and mind, we've got to stop killing. And in Buddhism, that's not just human beings, that's every living being. Some spiritual traditions is strictly just human beings, swat a fly, trap the rat, whatever, whatever, it's okay. Stealing, taking people's stuff, sexual misconduct, the 4 kinds of speech, not telling the truth by omission or exaggeration, disharmonious speech, speech that damns, humiliates, terrorizes, bullies, talking about things that aren't really important, gossip, idle talk, and then these 3 mental pathways, which we're seeing playing themselves out, this covetousness. We have somebody in our world right now who really wants this big island that's got no people on it, that's got, minerals in it, and he wants that, and he is going to strategize to see how he can get it. And then there's malice, which we all also have, is that we're just so averse to somebody that we just wish that something would happen to them, some way to retaliate, some way to get our revenge. This is a very deadly kind of mind. We can also see this not only out in the world, but we can see it in ourselves. And then the third one is just these wrong conceptions. And right now, the big one, which is maybe it's probably an acquired affliction, but might is right. One of the strongest misconceptions that we have. And that ethical consequences, if you have enough power, if you've got enough status, if you've got enough wealth, you can do pretty much whatever you want and not suffer any ethical consequences, which is one of the fundamental misconceptions of wrong view, is that there's any ethical component to our behavior. And that, once again, is playing itself out. If you can get away with it, why not? Now, Geshe Zopa makes an interesting point about these, is that he says, even without precepts, we can avoid doing anything that harms what matters the most to others. So there are three things, without even taking precepts. He said, first of all, is to not harm life, which is either physical or mental well-being. That is the most precious thing that we have. Whether we're a human, whether we're an animal, whether we're an insect, the most precious thing that we have is our lives. All right, number one. Number two, property, stuff. And not just physical stuff, but stealing other people's ideas, stealing somebody else's words, stealing somebody else's achievements. I mean, there's a whole bunch of thievery that we can engage in that has nothing to do with stuff, right? That's property. And then the third one, Geshe Zopa says, to try to avoid messing around with people's relationships, interfering, disharmony with divisive speech, flirting with people that are, in relationships, emotional abuse. I mean, just to be kind and just stay out of people's relationships and stop interfering and trying to navigate and strategize and harm those relationships. So the mindset is basically non-harm from our side. And the short term, which is so beautiful about ethical conduct, is that it not only has a long-term result, which is bodhicitta, wisdom, awakening, but the short-term result is that we have ease in our life. We have some clarity. We have no regrets. We walk into life saying, I'm pretty clear and clean what I'm going to refrain from doing right now and what I'm going to try to do. So there's a lessening of confusion. So even in this very life, the fruits of ethical conduct are apparent. It takes a lot of effort, but it's apparent. So here's the first thing about the ethics of restraint. And His Holiness wants to make this clear, because I don't know about you, but I think there are some of us who really struggle. What's the difference between restraint and denial? Suppress things rather than restraining things. And so His Holiness says, and as we as Americans or Westerners, I think we've got this thing because of individuality. We should be able to do what we want. We have autonomy. We should be able to live our lives and mind your own business. And so sometimes restraint seems a little bit like it is when they, capture somebody. They put you in shackles, put you in restraints. There's something kind of resistant in my own mind against being restrained. But His Holiness says that restraint is a voluntary, deliberate, and adopted discipline from our side based on the appreciation of the benefits of doing it. All right, so we begin to see, when I stop being a jerk voluntarily, there's no law, there's no commandment, there's nobody out there pressing on me, I see the benefits of restraining my body, speech, and mind. We've examined and experienced the results of curtailing harmful ways of thinking and behaving that seem to bring a little bit more clarity, a little bit more ease. My relationships go along better. I'm going to do this because I see the benefits. On the other hand, His Holiness says, suppressing or denying feelings is this false notion that we need to appear to be in control, a facade that we have it together because we are fearful or worry about what other people think. So we're doing the same action, but for all the wrong reasons. We've got the 8 worldly concerns involved in there. We've got praise. We've got attachment to reputation. We want something. We want to have a pleasant experience. So we're willing to just sort of pretend that we're ethical and being, morally upright people, when in fact we've got an ulterior motive that's happening. And so what I wanted to talk about, which is a little bit more as we move into so this is what we want to do, this practice of restraint. Where are some of the places where we have to be vigilant, where we can take some real make some real conscious decisions on how to restrain ourselves and build up this strength of mind. So I'm going to go over these 6 factors that do bring the arisal of afflictions and negative states and behaviors. We have it in the middle scope of the Lam Rim. This is stuff that happens every day. Some of them are very apparent changes in behavior and a level of vigilance that will really help us to bring our ethics of restraint up to where we want it to be. And some of them are more subtle because they're more inside the mind where it's a little bit harder to decipher. So I want to go through these because I have found them in my own practice to help me clarify when I'm in this situation, when I'm with these people, when I do these certain behaviors, I'm becoming vulnerable. I'm putting myself in a vulnerable position. So I want to go through those, which is really the main part of this sharing today, which I find really helpful. Because they end up really, it's a slippery slope. That's where we're going to go. Okay, so for the first one is the basis. This is one of those factors that it's not real apparent to us, and you have to have some willingness to understand that there is rebirth, that karma functions. So that's got to be somewhere in your purview, or this one really doesn't make any sense. So this is the one that we have this very subtle internal factor, which is every time we have an intention, set an intention under the control of either virtuous or non-virtuous states of mind, we plant a seed, an imprint, a potency on our mind. And so we have all these seeds since way beginningless time, from previous experiences of either virtuous or non-virtuous actions driven by particular states of mind. So, according to the Dharma, these afflictions that arise don't come because there's something going on outside of ourselves. That's the main perpetrator of this feeling that's arising, that we have these seeds quietly sleeping, laying low, dormant, until there are particular factors, triggers, things that happen in our lives that bring them up and water them like a seed. And so this one is a little bit harder if you don't believe in, the functioning of karma and rebirth. But once again, this is one of the ways in which it happens, because some mornings I wake up and I'm just grumpy. Give me my tea, leave me alone. I want to go back to bed. There was something that must have happened. There's a seed right up at the surface there, and maybe I got out of bed literally on the wrong side and watered that seed just enough to start the day with a really grouchy, grumpy mind that I'm just picking at everybody all day. It seems like it's free-floating, but it has a cause. It's in there, and I have fueled that with some kind of thinking, some kind of habit of mind, and so there it is. So it's not like that there's something going on outside that's poking at me to make this happen. It can trigger it, but it's not the substantial cause. So the second one is the mind needs an object, all right? Anger, jealousy, doubt, conceit, confusion. We need an object, whether it's an immaterial object, whether it's a living being, an idea, a situation, or an event that is like the water, the sunshine on the seed inside of our minds. And of course, the easy solution, they say, is, well, just avoid the object. Live in an environment that's much more conducive, but sometimes this is hard to do because sometimes these are the people and things that you live with that you can't avoid. We live in a flourishing insect world of quadrillion, bazillion insects who just happen to inhabit life with us, and sometimes we find them rather pesty. Well, they're there. They're going to be one of our objects of aversion. We have to make sure that we see that we have a problem with these little beings. We've got employers. They could be objects of our afflictions. Even our own responsibilities can drive us crazy. Even our bodies, even the food we eat, there is nothing that is safe from being an object of the arisal of our afflictions. We can almost guarantee even our dearest ones, who are one of the main focused objects of a lot of our afflictions. And so we have to be cognizant of this, and to moderate or to avoid them if possible, depending on how strong the affliction arises, how quickly it gets watered and fertilized when it comes in contact with the object. Okay, so that's the second one. And that, once again, this is one that is an external factor that we have some agency, we have some way to make some decisions about. Unlike the seeds of anger, which when we realize emptiness directly, we'll deal with them completely, gone. But until then, we've got to deal with them. The third one is society, the people we associate. Okay, these are probably the greatest. Talk about influencers, right? Influencers. They might be on TikTok, but they're also living in our house. And especially if they have bad habits, which we want to avoid doing. You know, I don't know but in my life, I have invited some pretty reckless characters into my life. And I was just in love with them and just found myself doing all sorts of things that I really knew better. But I went ahead and did it because I was just hooked into the whole excitement of being reckless, the excitement of getting away with something that I shouldn't be getting away with. I mean, there's all sorts of influence that people in our lives have. And it's not like, you know, Venerable keeps clarifying, they're not bad people. You know, our loved ones are not bad people. Our friends, our coworkers, our classmates, they're not bad people. It's just that they have habits and behaviors that take us in a different direction from what we are trying to, that compass. You know, we want to get that compass of virtue, integrity, compassion, kindness. And sometimes when we go with them, we're just a little bit off center. We're just like, we get a little bit caught up in worldly concerns. We get a little bit caught up with the pleasures of just this life, and we just kind of lose track of where our moral compass is. And that just to be careful who we spend time with, especially, this was with Venerable Sangye Kadra. She did a teaching on one of our Exploring Monastic Lives about these factors. And she said, especially when your practice is shaky and it's new, that you can be easily influenced by the people around you. Once you get a really strong practice, you can be with almost anybody, and you won't be pressured to behave in a way that is up against your principles and your integrity. Now, one of the things that I think is a common occurrence is that the more that you practice the Dharma and you surround yourselves with spiritual companions, that a lot of our friendships, even our partnerships, social circles, they end. It's like a natural attrition that once that it can be, you know, and there's a grief to it depending on how many friends and how close you are in relationship to your social circle and your mentors, is if you start practicing the Dharma and they're not quite sure what you're doing and they're almost a little bit concerned with you and trying to talk you out of what you're doing. And, but as time grows, as you grow in the Dharma, you have a lot less things of common interest. And like one by one, you see them less, you share with them less. You just want to spend your time with virtuous friends that have the qualities that we all want to develop. We want to emulate rather than saying, now I've got to like detox from my weekend with friends because we were doing all sorts of crazy things. And, you know, so to be able to, so this is a natural attrition that happens. And I know for a fact with one or two of my friends when I first came here, not only did I have the physical distancing that provided some fuel for that natural attrition, but there was definitely a grief. There was definitely a letting go because some of these people were wonderful, bright, creative people, but they just weren't tracking kind of the same track that I was tracking. And so after a while, it kind of went by the wayside. So that is one of the things about really choosing our friends well, if we can. Number 4 is the source of information. Okay, here we go. Here's the biggest influencer that we have, the influencer of influences, is, you know, all of this stuff. The news, social media, the internet, books, movies, all sorts of social platforms that can really impact our emotions and thoughts and throw us off course in regards to ethical conduct. There's something it says it's kind of an anomaly, but we're quite fascinated by crazy stuff that crazy people do. We're just drawn to tragedies and outrageous behavior. There's something, because it's such an anomaly to some fundamental nature of our good hearts. It's like, wow, how can you do that? That's really interesting. That's so bizarre. Let me go see what's going on. And you go down these crazy paths about being fascinated by some really misinformed stuff. And even with Buddhism, I mean, when you go on YouTube and you put in a subject of Buddhism, it's got a great title, but it's filled with a lot of wrong conceptions. It's somebody making up the path as they go, but they've called it the Buddha Dharma, you know, and it's like, so there's there's a vigilance and a moderation and a real need for a strategy on how much are we willing to just put ourselves in the place of being influenced by social media and the news. We need to keep informed. We need to be wise about it so that we know what's going on in the world. But boy, it's such a huge hook. And even the good stuff on the internet, we can also go overboard on that. Just keep looking at all the good stuff, all the good stuff. We've, 3 hours later, we're still looking at the good stuff, still looking at the good stuff, still looking. We've forgotten our practice, we've forgotten our offering service, we've forgotten our baths, we haven't fed our kids, who knows? We just kind of get swept away. So that's number 4. Number 5 is familiarity. Oh yeah, the more we do something, the easier it becomes. And this just is not in regards to just our daily tasks, our work skills, but it's the physical and verbal actions, and the afflictions or the motivations that are behind them. And the more we do something, the more familiar it becomes. The critical mind can be a default if we listen to a lot of people who complain and kvetch and are judgmental. It becomes like part of our daily speech. We're such creatures of habit which is why the misinformation in the world right now is so dangerous, because if people listen to enough erroneous information, they begin to believe it as the truth. And right now, it's really hard to figure out parts of what's true and what's not true. And the tragedy is that after listening to politicians who demonize, criticize, rage, exaggerate, and saying things that aren't true, after a while you begin to believe it. There's no logic behind it, there's no data behind it, but there's something about our minds that they get stronger the more frequently we do something, which can be used as a great asset, because if we want to cultivate virtue and good behaviors, we start doing them more and more. We also start gaining a familiarity, so that becomes the default. But because we're samsaric beings, the virtue is like, pushing this huge boulder up the hill. Oh, I blew it in. I'm not even trying. But as the Buddha, says that trying to practice virtue is like rolling a huge boulder up a steep hill. We're creating non-virtue is just the water rolling off the roof of the Buddha hall, taking out the swales. It's just down the hill roaring. So here we have to learn the tools to cultivate new ways of thinking, and mindfulness and introspective awareness are really good to keep checking our minds. Where are they going? What are we habituating ourselves to? What are we ruminating about? What are we proliferating about? And to start slowly turn the mind to things that really matter, things that really bring joy to our minds, lightness to our minds, brightness to our minds. But this is a real powerful factor that can bring afflictions real easily. We have to be so vigilant when it comes to these habits of thinking. And then last but not least is this obsessive thinking is one of the ways that is described, or inappropriate attention. And this is really taking some object, some thought, some construct, and zooming in on it and ruminating about it over and over again, which happens, I think, or at least for me, when I get into an argument or a conflict. Once I leave that exchange, I go away and I just build up the court case. I become the lawyer, the prosecutor, the defense, the prosecuting attorney, the jury, the judge, and I just proliferate on justifying why I had a right to be angry, why I had a right to try to get my way. So there is this inappropriate attention. It's a very powerful mental factor because it just ruminates, it just habituates to particular wrong ways of thinking. And after a while, the exaggeration and the projection on this object, we are basically getting upset and afflicted over a non-existent object. We have built something that doesn't exist, and we're really angry about it. Not about the fact that we've done something really foolish for our own well-being, but that we have created an object that we believe is the source of all of our suffering. So that is something that's very, very important, this introspective awareness and mindfulness when it comes to watching our thoughts. And so in the book here, Venerable, His Holiness talks about he spoken with a psychologist, his name was Aaron Beck, who had done some research on anger and hatred. And through his data, he came to the conclusion that we are angry or hate someone, we see them as 100% bad. Well, Aaron says 90% of that is our projection. That only 10% is actually the person in front of us who we're having difficulty with. And His Holiness said he was so delighted because he says that's what the great Indian master Nagarjuna said also, is that 90% projection, that we're making up a story about the object that we believe is the cause of our pain. And so that's part of this inappropriate attention, to be able to counteract this, to the spinning of stories around anything. And that's not just the stuff that we're averse to, but the things and the people and the situations that we're extremely clingy and attached to as well. So some of the ways that we can help with ourselves just in the course of any given day is to calm the mind down using the breath. Sometimes when I'm getting afflicted because my mind's getting out of control, I'll say some mantra that I really love. You know, the Chenrezi's mantra, Vajrasattva mantra is so helpful. Learn the antidotes. Look at the positive qualities of a person. We really want to pull the rug out under this afflictive state of mind. And so there's a lot of different mechanisms to be able, but we have to identify where it is where these afflictions arise. Where do we start going down the slippery slope of non-virtue? These are a lot of the factors where we put ourselves in situations where that's going to happen. So we just have to be really, to think about these, look at these, see the kinds of habits of mind. What are the objects that we continually go to and put a lot of inappropriate attention? Who are the people in our lives? Where do we go on social media that is not helpful? I mean, there's a lot of ways in which we can in a practical way, avert some of the non-virtuous states of mind and actions that we have. Okay, then the second ethical conduct is the conduct of gathering virtue. So as we practice the ethics of restraint, our mind will have more space, believe it or not. And in that space, we may be able to start placing a little bit more virtuous states of mind. We find ourselves a little bit clearer, not so easily upset, not so up and down like a roller coaster. We'll catch the non-virtuous states sooner because we've been using mindfulness and introspective awareness. We've got some antidotes that are helpful. We're starting to challenge, is this true what I'm thinking? So we're slowly starting to grow more positive states of mind. And one of the things about virtue is not only do we want to cultivate these beautiful states of mind, but some of us have natural dispositions for having virtue already. Some of us find it real easy to be compassionate, easy to be kind, easy to be forgiving, easy to be generous. So we want to hold those, not only hold them, but nourish them and make sure that they don't fall apart. And then ones that we see in other people that we really like, that we just want to emulate. There are qualities in some of our world leaders that I just treasure. I mean, I treasure Jimmy Carter. He had so many qualities despite what he went through. He just kept his mind so in his virtue, so in seeing the goodness of humanity. Something that's really hard to do, but he never flinched from that feeling. And so to really try to emulate the qualities that we see in others, in ourselves. And then also, His Holiness says it's really important to not dismiss or minimize this virtue. Not to be conceited about them, but to rejoice that our minds are turning toward virtue and benefiting others. So I wanted to share with you, he kind of talks, so what's this humility thing? Is even humility even considered to be something we want to cultivate these days? So he says we don't want to dismiss or minimize, but we don't want to get puffed up and exaggerate and become conceited about our good qualities. So here's what he says. To say that humility is an essential ingredient in our pursuit of transformation may seem to be at odds with what I've just said. He talked about the need for confidence. But just as there is clearly a distinction between valid confidence in the sense of self-esteem, self-respect, and conceit, which can be described as an inflated sense of importance grounded in a false image of self, so it is important to distinguish between genuine humility, which is a form of modesty, and a lack of confidence. They are not the same thing, although they get confused a lot. This may explain in part why today humility is often thought of as a weakness rather than an indication of inner strength, especially in the context of business and professional life. He says, in contemporary life, humility is more important than ever. The more successful we humans become, both as individuals and as family through our development of science, technology, the more essential it becomes to preserve humility. For the greater our temporal achievements, the more vulnerable we become to pride and arrogance. So that is really, I find that to be true for myself. So to be able to recognize that our virtues are hard-won, that they are a sign of incredible growth and strength of ourselves, and to be able to, they just help us keep that true north. And humility is based on such inner strength, such faith in one's own ability to benefit, to be kind, to live life meaningfully, that we don't need to put on airs, we don't have to put on a show, we don't have to puff ourselves up. So he's really encouraging that humility would be a wonderful quality for people in our world, all of us from where we are all the way up to the great leaders, to be able to be modest and self-confident rather than be conceitful? What's the word? Conceited. And that the root of all success is in our spiritual practice and the happiness in this life. This gathering of virtue is so much a part of the nourishment. Once the restraint, once we really start seeing the integrity kick in, this ability to respect ourselves so much that we're willing to hold the line on our ethics, despite pressure, despite our wanting to be attached to our reputation, to praise, we hold the line. And that to have this consideration for others, which once again is really powerful, to not only hold on to our own values and principles because it serves us well, is then to consider how is my behavior, how are my actions, how is my speech impacting my relationship to other beings. That's the consideration of others. And those are two of the beautiful mental factors that come along with not only the ethics of restraint, but also the ethics of gathering virtue. And Geshe Sopa also says that we increase our time spent listening to teachings. When we start cultivating virtue, we start taking care of ourselves differently. He says we start eating and sleeping properly, we start practicing generosity, we start helping others, that there's this natural progression once we're starting to clear the decks on the restraint side of ethical conduct and start gathering the virtue and start gathering these good qualities, life just opens up. Our whole relationship to the world changes. And so then we segue into this last form of ethical conduct, which is called benefiting others, or as His Holiness says, the ethics of compassion. So then, as our mind gets more subdued and clear through restraint, integrity, consideration for others, and is brightened by the growth of our good qualities, benefiting others becomes a natural impulse of moving outward and moving into the stream of sentient beings in a very direct, intentional kind of way. There is a warmth, this wanting to step in. There's this warmth on wanting to take care. There's this intention to alleviate pain and unhappiness where we can. And so when we get to this third part, the Buddha lists very clearly, well, where can we step in? Who are those that we want to benefit And it just happens to be right now, coincidentally, a lot of the people right now that are not being helped by governments, that are not being able to be helped. In fact, they're being ignored and deprived of basic life needs. So these are the beings in which right in our own local area, just right in the neighborhood, right in town, that we can be able to bring this clear, clean, growing, compassionate mind into the stream where sentient beings really need us the most. And so this is 129, 130. This book, by the way, is 25 years old. And I want to tell you that there's nothing in this book that is not relevant to this life right now. His Holiness had such an intuition. In the beginning here, in 2000, I mean, technology was pretty much kind of at its infancy. It was just starting to get going. And he said, watch out. This is a good thing. This can be a good thing, but this can also be a major, major suffering if we don't learn how to hold it and use it appropriately. And that's kind of a little bit of a prediction that he made that's somewhat coming true. Okay, 129, 130, that's what I have here. Ah, yes. So while we're trying to help beings who are suffering, and this is kind of an interesting, I had to read this over a few times because I was trying to see what the point was that His Holiness was making, because it's kind of subtle. Let's see if you can track this. Some people may object to this ideal of being able to, care for people who are suffering, stepping into that and sharing the suffering with them. Entering to others' suffering, we bring suffering on ourselves. To the extent this is true. But I suggest that there is an important qualitative distinction to be made between experiencing one's own suffering and experience suffering in the course of sharing in others. All right, here's the distinction, and just listen to what he says. This is I found it really subtle. In the case of one's own suffering, given that it is involuntary, there is a sense of oppression. It seems to come from outside. By contrast, sharing in someone else's suffering must at some level involve a degree of voluntariness, which itself is indicative of a certain inner strength. For this reason, the disturbance it may cause is considerably less like to paralyze us than our own suffering. That other suffering, to think of that, we could actually hold that more than we do our own, because our suffering sometimes feels like it's being imposed on us, coming from some outside horrible show that's putting it on us. Where to share somebody else's suffering, we are intentionally, voluntarily stepping into that. Of course, even as an ideal, the notion of developing an unconditional compassion is daunting. Most people, including myself, must struggle even to reach the point where putting others' interest on par with my own becomes easy. That is a struggle even for His Holiness. We should not allow to put this off, however. And while undoubtedly there will be obstacles on the way to developing a genuinely warm heart, there is the deep consolation of knowing that in doing so, we are creating the conditions for our own happiness. Compassion and love, as Venerable Kunga said last night, are not mere luxuries. As the source of both inner and external peace, they are fundamental to the continual survival of our species. On the one hand, they constitute nonviolence in action, right? So while benefiting others, that's why he calls it the ethics of compassion. On the other hand, they are the source of spiritual qualities of forgiveness, tolerance, and all the virtues. Moreover, they are the very thing that gives meaning to our activities and makes them constructive. There is nothing amazing about being highly educated. There is nothing amazing about being rich. Only when the individual has a warm heart do these attributes become worthwhile. Need I say more? And so I just want to give a list of some of the folks the people that we really want to put into our sphere of compassion. Those in fear, lots of those. Those in misery, right? This is a deep, deep form of suffering. Those in poverty. Those who need friends. This is where it's always so helpful to have good listening skills. And those who are on the wrong path, which is a very profound suffering, but to have no expectation that you're going to be able to deter and redirect them. So once again, to be able to benefit sentient beings without any expectation that we're going to solve the problems of individuals, solve the problems of our families, solve the problems of the world. But it should not discourage us from stepping into the stream. And that is so important to understand. So then, before I open the floor, there's something here that His Holiness says. This is just so wise. When we neglect others' well-being and ignore the universal dimension of our actions, because he has this whole thing about universal responsibility. This is one of the terms that he has used for 40 years, universal responsibility, that we have a responsibility to each other. It is inevitable that we will come to see our interest as separate from theirs. We will overlook the fundamental oneness of the human family. And of course, it's easy to point the numerous factors which work against this notion of unity. Okay, this is where we go a lot. This is where we're going right now a lot. That includes differences of religious faith, language, customs, culture. You can throw in politics in there if you want. But when we put too much emphasis on superficial differences, and on account of them make even small, rigid discriminations, we cannot avoid bringing about additional suffering both for ourselves and others. And he has said this a few times in the book. This makes no sense. And he's going to tell us why. We humans already have enough problems. We all face death, age, old age, sickness, not to mention the inevitability of meeting with disappointment. These we simply cannot avoid. Isn't that enough? What is the point of creating still more unnecessary problems simply on the basis of different ways of thinking or different skin color? Judging these realities, we see that both ethics and the necessity call for the same response. In order to overcome our tendency to ignore others' needs and rights, we must continually remind ourselves what is obvious, that basically we are all the same. Don't we have enough problems? You know, in a part of this book here, he says, you know, there's two kinds of events in the world. The events of natural catastrophes, okay, the tornadoes, the floods, the tsunamis. He says the other events are human created. And he starts with the kings and the presidents. He goes all the way down to the people who dig the ditches in the world. He says, this is the cause of all the unhappiness in the world, is us. And so he really, you know, this whole idea about benefiting others, how can we counteract his propensity to keep separating ourselves in order to bring up even more difficulties and more problems than we already have. So that is kind of where I went with the 3 kinds of ethical conduct. And I wanted to right now, before maybe we could do a little meditation, but I wanted to see if folks have comments or questions in response to these 3 kinds. Where are you on the trajectory? How are you doing? Where do you find struggles? What have you found helpful? Because this is a life journey. This is a lifetime journey from now until when we become Buddhas. And this whole process and practice of ethical conduct becomes a perfection where we are ethically perfect, not only in our sleeping, but in our waking, in our dreams. Everything is from the side of pure ethical conduct. This is a practice in progress. So if anybody would like to share where they are, where they struggle, where they succeed, that would be great. Venerable Kunga.
I really appreciate you reading the part about the difference between our own suffering and sharing in the suffering of others, because I've had this really long-standing question of whether compassion entails suffering. On the one hand, compassion is a virtuous mental state, and it brings happiness to when I help others. On the other hand, to open my heart to their suffering also causes pain. So one of the major obstacles for my compassion has been getting past that pain that arises when I tune in to the suffering of others. And I was just wondering, the Bodhisattva has so much compassion. Do they also have a ton of suffering at the same time? So it's really been something I've thought a lot about. And so I'm thankful for His Holiness for acknowledging that, yes, it does bring about pain when you acknowledge that others are suffering. But at the same time, it's quite different than experiencing your own suffering. It's much more manageable, much more maybe even empowering. It sounds like the way he describes. It helps you to recognize your own inner strength. So it's really transforming our relationship to suffering. It's no longer just a bad thing. It becomes something that we can use to transform our minds and get closer to awakening. And then the other thing about familiarity, like I find that to be a huge, one of my main, living here, there's not a whole lot of external stimuli that cause afflictions to arise, but I just noticed so many negative mental habits, and I'm familiar with them. So they're comforting, they're, familiar, they seem right, just because I'm so familiar with them. And, at first I felt like moving here was like going through detox, because I was so used to getting the hits that come from, indulging attachment or indulging my anger. And the happiness that comes from ethics is quite subtle at first. And it's like, I always thought of it as like, this is an acquired taste. So
I would say that's very well put, Venerable Kunga.
It takes a while to really appreciate the benefits of ethics.
Yeah.
Because it's much more subtle than the rush of eating
Afflictions.
junk food or going to the amusement park. And we're just so habituated to that. It's quite difficult.
Yeah.
And we're going through like rehab when we practice the Dharma. And that's a real reason to have compassion for other people who may be not so attracted to the Dharma and don't want to put in that effort. It's not easy.
Yeah. Thanks for your sharing, Venerable Kunga. I think the two responses, I'm not quite sure, when you were talking about the suffering, I'm not sure the way you had it changed, but His Holiness said that our own suffering seems to come from outside and seems to be oppressive, where because we voluntarily step into the stream of suffering of others, coming from our own side, the inner strength that takes is actually an easier thing to do. As far as bodhisattvas, they've realized the nature of reality. There is no inherent existent suffering whatsoever. That whole objectless compassion that sees it as unnecessary, the suffering, that is transitory, and that there is no inherently existent sufferer. There's no inherently existent suffering. But to have the kind of mind that doesn't have suffering, I think is incomprehensible to me at this time. And that the bodhicitta, it just, there's no hesitation on stepping into the realms of suffering for them, that there's nothing but joy, there's nothing but the clarity that says what's happening here is due to these causes. And I have understood through my realization of emptiness that these causes can be eradicated. They can be ceased. And so there must be this incredible confidence in the Four Noble Truths, actualizing them, that just makes them totally fearless in the face of some of the most horrendous, going to the hell realms and being able to keep your wherewithal and to be able to benefit in that kind of condition. And as far as the habits, it is an acquired taste. I think, but when you start recognizing that, you wake up one day and the sky is blue and the birds are singing, and you're like, I'm fine. There's nothing pressing. There's nothing, because I've been doing my purification. I've been catching my afflictions a little bit sooner. I've got a few tools in my back pocket for my anger and my irritation and my greed about what's for lunch, that I can go through the world and not always get this hooked. There is a relief. And having all the precepts that we have, at first I was like, you gotta be kidding. But now I see the importance of even the small things, the comportment things, the offenses that are minor, that how they protect me from going down this habituated slippery slope that I just want to fall into without much thinking. So I think the familiarity of virtue becomes really a powerful motivator to just continue with cultivating this particular state of mind. But I think your insights are really spot on as far as the withdrawal from that. And we're always going to be hooked until we realize the nature of reality. It's going to be a less and less struggle on not getting hooked, because the appearance of inherent existence is still going to be there. We're still going to be a little bit not quite sure. But boy, after a while, I just can't imagine what it's like to have the perfection of ethical conduct. It must be beyond. Yeah. Yes, Sven, what you need?
I like that analogy of the acquired taste. And what I'm thinking of is the reason that in every single teaching on how we work with the afflictions, the antidotes start with looking at the disadvantages. Like if we're habituated to these mind states, then we often don't see the trouble that they cause. But once we start drilling down on, oh, this is what happens when I'm angry. Oh, this is what happens when I'm angry. Then it's easier to develop an appetite for something very, very different, because we start to recognize the level of suffering that they cause, even just on a superficial day-to-day level.
Yeah.
Yeah, not even talking about the karma they create, which is also profound. So.
And one of the drilling down is to realize that it isn't coming from outside. That's probably the first drill down. And then going deeper than that. But to pull the responsibility off the world is one of the biggest drill downs that we have. Selden.
I think for me, if I'm feeling pain when I try and have compassion for someone else, I think it's my self-centered, self-grasping mind, my focus taking away from myself onto others. That's the pain, I think.
Not being able to, or the self-centered thought is fighting that?
It's fighting that. Yeah, that's the pain I feel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What about me?
Yep. Yeah, because we're, and it's not our fault, it's just the way we're kind of wired.
Habituated.
Habitually, just to focus on ourselves. So.
Yeah. Wrangle the compassion out of ourselves.
So there's two questions online, and one person asks, how can a layperson that lacks the external seclusion of a monastic community cultivate that seclusion internally and externally for themselves?
That's a good question. We're not as secluded as we appear. Because the bodhicitta compels us to keep our doors open 9 months out of the year. In fact, ever since I came and joined this community, I have met more sentient beings than I would have met if I had lived a lay life and had been able to strategize on who was going to come and who wasn't going to come. So that's one of the myths that we have to really clarify. And then once again, not knowing the particular circumstances of this friend who's asking the question, is, there's the small bits of time management, the bits of really prioritizing what you want to do with your time. It's carving out, we even have to carve out in this community time for our studies, time for our practice. You have to find the way to do that. I can't figure that out for you. But if you really do know that at the end of the day, when the kids are asleep or your husband's asleep or whoever, to be able to go someplace in your life where you can sit down, look over the day, rejoice in all the things that have happened from your side and all the good things that have happened that have come to you, is a great way to produce the inner solitude and clarity that you're striving for. And also to say, well, today that didn't land well. That was really a mistake. And do the regret, do the purification. That also brings a form of ease and of stability and of warmth in one's own internal experience as well. So taking what comes to you in life, using it to either purify, rejoice, cultivate whatever qualities you can, brings the environment internally to where you can actually go there for your own solace, go there for your own balancing, recentering. And then to try as best as you can to create whatever conducive circumstance, a space in your home, the backyard, finding walks or doing whatever you can do to just bring yourself, step away from your life enough to just look at it through a bigger lens. And it takes some doing, but I don't think it's impossible. Yeah. And then, is that the...
Someone asks, is there overlap between the ethics of gathering virtue and the ethics of benefiting others?
Well, there's a weaving of all three of them, actually. I think without the first two of the restraint and the one of gathering virtue, to be able to benefit others, there might be, more often than not, temptations to do it for all the wrong reasons. I think that the 8 worldly concerns would be involved a lot more if we didn't recognize that we need to restrain our actions of body, speech, and mind. We would do it for reputation. We would do it to get something. We would have some ulterior motive. And then the second one, as far as gathering virtue, it just gives us the kind of joy and the kind of willingness that it requires to be of benefit. So I think both the first two bring the fruits of then having the warmth, the willing to step into the stream. So I think it's not just the gathering of virtue is woven into being able to benefit, but I think the ethic of restraint is crucial too, as far as clarifying the motivations of why we're even going to bother. Nicole had her hand up, and then Venerable Chuni.
Venerable, I just wanted to add to your answer about really incorporating the Dharma into lay lifestyle. Like everything that you said, absolutely, about finding time here and there and just gradually changing your life. But what I've found is that before you even really arrive at an answer, how do I fit the Dharma into my life? The question changes to how do I fit my life into the Dharma? And you never have a real concrete list of things that you need to do to make this transition, this mental transition, really a big part of your lifestyle. So that's just been my experience of it.
That is a great help, Nicole, to know that there really is a process. There really is a process. And Venerable Jenny.
Just a reflection for the community, the ethics of gathering virtue could easily be called creating merit.
To avoid any confusion, folks, gathering virtue is accumulating merit. They are synonymous. There's no deep science here. There's just Selden.
I think how I do it in the Abbey, how I try to stay connected with, I'm surrounded by Dharma, but my own personal practice, as much as I can, I try and think of just not being critical of others, judging, why is that car so slow in front of me, or watching that mind and trying to say to myself over and over again that, well, they're just trying to be happy and avoid suffering. And that is going to create merit, and that's going to make me feel better for myself than if I got mad because, the car crossed 3 lanes and turned in front of me, or, whatever, or if there's a music playing somewhere that I don't like, or, on and on, So introspective awareness to watch that critical mind and say, well, they're just trying to be happy, That's how I think I gain self-confidence.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Keith.
Thank you, Venerable. This is very stimulating talk. I really appreciate it. The line that really stuck out for me, all of this has been great, but the one that really hit me, we cannot succeed without ethical discipline. That really hit me hard, like a strong emotional wave, and I was wondering in myself, what was that about? And I think one of the things it's about was recognizing my own transformation and progress on this path, like this deep knowing through my own realization that that is the truth. And then there's a disillusionment and that sadness and grief again that so much of our leadership in the government right now, the federal government especially, is not being led through ethical discipline. It's through the worldly concerns. And there's just still this loss for me, this grief, like probably unrealistic expectations on my part that our leaders would be role models for this ethical discipline. And instead, they really are true reflections of samsara and the 8 worldly concerns, like on steroids at this point. And yeah, so there's sadness about that. And then to end on a more positive note, when I was thinking also about like our government for the last, several years has gotten me clearer and clearer about my motivations for watching the news. Why am I watching the news? Is it to feed, this fascination with the craziness and outrageousness? And I think at a time that was true, but that's gotten more and more refined. I'm very selective. I'm watching the news to find examples of ethical behavior, ethical leaders in our system, ones that I want to listen to that are going to feed and influence that more in me. And I'm finding some of them, mentioning Cory Booker, yes. Bernie Sanders, he can be edgy, for sure. Although I resonate, this is just one man's opinion, with a deep compassion. I think he really has a very compassionate heart, very compassionate motivations. So my motivations for watching the news is not to feed with the craziness, but to seek out those leaders and those people I can get behind and work with and be part of that movement.
And they're out there. And they're out there.
Yes.
And this whole deep knowing that you cannot succeed without ethical discipline. So the whole unfolding right now that is bereft of most of that, we already see the writing on the wall. There will be temporary success. There will be power accumulated, But the long-term goal of the benefit of the world and this is not going to succeed the way it's going. And that is the truth of what that non-harm is not happening, and therefore this is not going to succeed.
And back to samsara on steroids, I mean, the amount of suffering that we can see, the writing on the wall and things unfolding, the amount of suffering caused by this deep attachment to the worldly concerns. It's a very graphic opportunity to see that and learn more deeply about it.
And the more that this unfolds, to be very vigilant of what we're going to try to cling to. What are we going to, as far as the 8 worldly concerns? And one of them is, how things used to be. This whole concept of this permanent phenomena called democracy, or equity, or freedom of speech, or freedom of assembly. When it continues to go the way it's going, where are we going to start trying to hook in to give ourselves some certainty, give ourselves some security, give ourselves some? And it'll be the Dharma, the refuge, will become even more crucial to be able to anchor ourselves in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and not on these, grasping at straws, which are not going to really serve. Okay, folks, let's go. Yeah, let's go. We got time, Amy.
So just one quick thing about the how do you keep your Dharma outside your life. I did read an interesting Theravada Sutra once, A Better Way to Live Alone. It was in a collection by Thich Nhat Hanh, but Buddha was speaking to a monk who went away to live in a cave because that was the best way to practice, he thought. And Buddha was correcting him, telling him how living with other people could be a better way to live alone. So you have to read it I'll let you read Buddha and what he said about that.
Leave me alone.
Well, no, it was basically talking about what, some of the things you talked about. But then I wanted to talk about compassion, but I'll get there first. When I was driving here, Venerable Kunga has cleared this up for me. When I was driving here, I was trying to follow the rules and use my voice recognition. And so first I was going to Sravasti Abbey. And then next I was going to Sobriety Abbey. So Venerable Kunga has cleared that up because now I understand, like rehab, there is an aspect of rehab. I thought of all the joy here and thought it wasn't sober at all, but, anyways. But, so compassion is tough, and so stepping into the suffering of others, not to contradict the Dalai Lama at all, but at least I think in my own life, I've stepped into the suffering of others at times for the wrong reasons, kind of used it as a way, I realize now, to not deal with some of my own suffering because I could work on other people's suffering and fix that. And looking back, in some ways it didn't touch me as much, it wasn't my own, so that was easier, but I also didn't do it in a very, or at least like the most constructive way. And so there's a lot of work to do on as we all know, like on ourselves. Now I see so many different ways I could have acted in certain situations or helped them. And so then when we look at our society, obviously a lot of people are suffering and have challenges in their lives, that cause them to want, a different president or all this change. And a lot of us want to help. And so I think also like working on ourselves so that we can help in the best way. And yeah, I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amy. All right, so let's just take a moment here and then we'll dedicate all the thoughtful thinking and the sharing, this beautiful practice of so crucial in our own lives and in the relationships to the world. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their sufferings. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forever.